Aren't we all seekers? Aren't we all in search of something? Are we all in search of meaning? Join us as we take a look into our past, into the world of the ancients. We will journey with two explorers, George S. Alexander and Natalis Rosen, as they join the lines between fact and myth to make an astonishing discovery. A great civilization, a noble and powerful people, warriors, wealth, royalty, luxury, a lost legendary land. Is there any evidence that the ancient city of Atlantis could have existed? Could there be any truth behind the mystery, and how could we find out? History, as always, is a good place to start. I came across writings from the Greek philosopher Plato, who lived about 2,400 years ago. His descriptions of the 12,000-year-old Atlantis were very detailed and gave clues to everything from the size of Atlantis to its location, to the culture of the people who would have inhabited Atlantis at the time. Atlantis, to many, is no more than a legend, a myth. But as my research into Plato's work grew and deepened, Atlantis started to become more and more real.
But how did Plato obtain his information about the lost city?
His writings reveal that Plato received all his information from one of his ancestors called Solon, who lived 200 years before Plato. Solon was a great Greek statesman, and he was said to have invented democracy. Solon had traveled to Egypt, to the city of Sais, to find out more about the ancient history of our civilization. In those days, Egypt had the longest documented historical records available. Solon, as a statesman, had a vested interest to find out about the origin of human civilization and culture. There, an old Egyptian priest told him about the lost city of Atlantis and its mighty ancient empire, catastrophes, and war. He showed him the ancient hieroglyphs in the Egyptian temple, which detailed the story of Atlantis. According to the inscriptions, Egypt was once a colony of Atlantis, and that's how the ancient Egyptians had received this information. Unfortunately, the Temple of Sais doesn't exist anymore. It was built in the Nile Delta, in a swamp area, and is literally sunk into the soil. However, via Solon and Plato, the information from the ancient temple was preserved. Solon's detailed notes about the existence of this great empire were published 6 generations later by his descendant, Plato, the great philosopher. This is how the great legend survived.
So exactly what details did Plato save for future generations?
If we consider Africa 12,000 years ago, with some of its land laying 150 meters below sea level, then the coastline may have looked very similar to this. And according to Plato, these countries were colonies of Atlantis at the time. Plato tells us that the empire of Atlantis consisted of 10 kingdoms and was made up of a number of islands, coastlines, and peninsulas in the Atlantic Ocean. It was positioned outside Gibraltar, bordering on southern Spain, once called Cadiz. Today's city of Cadiz reminds us of the ancient name. The main island was also called Atlantis and was about 700 kilometers across. It had mountains around the coast and a great central plain. Its most prominent feature was the capital city of Atlantis. Plato gave a measurement of 127 stadia to the overall width of the city. If we take the ancient Greek conversion of 185 meters per stadia, it would make the capital city of Atlantis about 23.5 kilometers across. A huge city. Its layout was highly unusual, a city consisting of circles of land and water. Here are Plato's exact words.
There were alternate zones of sea and land, larger and smaller, encircling one another. There were 2 of land and 3 of water.
Here we have 2 land rings and 3 water rings, as Plato explained. The center of the city, unlike today's cities, was sparsely populated and was the holy and sacred center of the empire of Atlantis. It housed the king, royal family and their palaces, servants, and the magnificent temple of Poseidon, which was the main god of the Atlanteans. It also included the fabled Garden of Poseidon, with exotic trees and fruits, cold and hot springs, fountains and pools. This area was reserved for the royal elite and high priests only. It was protected by mighty walls and a ring of water. The first land ring can be described as the religious sector of the city. It was said to have been home to a large priesthood who performed numerous rituals and sacrifices at various shrines. It had towers, gates, and hanging gardens. Atlantis had a powerful navy, and the second water ring, according to Plato, was the military harbor that docked at least 1,200 warships. The second land ring housed the military and would have had living quarters for up to 240,000 sailors to man the ships. This ring also housed the naval stores and supplies. It had underground docks, soldiers' training facilities, towers and guardhouses. It had a road or a racetrack in the middle of it, which was 200 meters wide and ran right around the second land ring. This land ring was the military center of the empire. The third water ring was the harbor for merchant ships and also functioned as a public transport system, with small boats ferrying people from one part of the city to the other. Plato then describes the outer wall, which encircles what one would today call downtown Atlantis.
The area between the outer wall and the merchant harbor was densely crowded and busy all day and all night.
This indicates an enormous area, and if it was densely populated, then it suggests that the city of Atlantis had a truly immense population. The city may have been home to over 1 million people. It was considered a city of the gods, a utopia, rich in architecture, bustling with trade, and protected by a great army. And then, in a single day of violent upheaval about 12,000 years ago, Atlantis was completely destroyed. We can see here how comprehensively Plato had described the city's shape, design, and even its dimensions, a very unique model of a city set in water. Plato was a reputable philosopher and statesman and would not have risked jeopardizing his status by inventing a myth. Anyone during that time could have gone to Egypt to verify what he had said. Plato insisted that what he was saying was true. In his day, honor and truth were held higher than the value of life.
This tale about Atlantis, though strange, is certainly true, having been attested by Solon, who was the wisest of the 7 sages.
Where would one find such a mighty structure? Surely, if it was as large as Plato had mentioned, it should be easy enough to find, unless it had sunken beneath the ocean, as legend suggests. I needed to look a little deeper, or higher for that matter. Since man launched into space, we've been able to observe the Earth from higher than ever before, seeing all formations on our planet's surface from a completely new perspective. With all the facts before me, I came across something astonishing. During earlier space missions, an exceptional structure was spotted in a forgotten corner of the Sahara Desert, a place that has puzzled scientists and geologists ever since its discovery. It is called the Richat, the Eye of Africa, a very unique formation which raises many questions. From space, the Richat is easily visible. Its prominent bullseye shape stands out in a circular form from an otherwise featureless Saharan desert. Because of its contours, it was dubbed the Eye of Africa. It stretches about 50 kilometers across, while the ring structure spans over 23 kilometers. Surprisingly, it has an almost perfect symmetry. Ground observations could not provide consensus amongst researchers about the origins of the magnificent structure. Some scientists thought it was a massive impact crater, but the lack of shock-altered rock questions that theory. Others propose that it was formed by volcanic activity, like a volcano before eruption that ran out of energy and collapsed into itself. The debate of its formation rages on. One thing is clear: the place has been severely eroded and washed out. Interesting for one of the driest places on Earth.
What the Richat is, or how it was formed, is a riddle. Its symmetry makes it look almost like a man-made structure. But for George and I, the fascination lies in how closely the Richat resembles the circular layout of Plato's Atlantis.
I took the shape of Atlantis, as Plato had described, and placed it beside the Eye of Africa. The match is very close. Many people have searched for the origins of Atlantis under the waves of the Atlantic, the Mediterranean, and even the South China Seas. But suddenly here I was, confronted with the possibility that the remains of the ocean empire are hidden in the Saharan desert, in the remote country of Mauritania. Mauritania is situated in West Africa, south of Morocco, bordered by the Atlantic Ocean, Senegal, Mali, and Algeria. The climate is mostly hot and arid. Approximately 3/4 of the country is desert or semi-desert, and as a result of severe drought, the desert has been expanding. I had to see the Richat structure for myself, and I convinced Natalis to join me on a fact-finding mission to Mauritania. For us, a journey into the unknown. To reach the Richat is not that easy. Our journey would take us from Paris to Nouakchott by plane, and then we would travel by car from Nouakchott to the Richat.
Mauritania is about the same size as Egypt. While Egypt has a population of about 78 million people, Mauritania is home to only 3 million people. The Islamic population speaks French and Arabic. One can't get very far on English alone. Mauritanians are proud to preserve their Islamic traditions and culture. The shoreline is bustling with fishermen, living as their ancestors did thousands of years ago. Mauritania's coastal waters are amongst the richest fishing areas in the world. About 5 kilometers inland from today's coastline lies Mauritania's biggest city, called Nouakchott. The name means place of the wind.
As one walks around the city, it becomes evident that the ocean played a major role in the growth of this place. Everywhere you look or walk are seashells, the pavements, the walkways, even embedded in the tar, almost as if the whole city had been built upon seashells. On our road journey from the sea towards the Richat, we decided to look out for evidence that would link the area to Plato's description of Atlantis. If we were on the right track, then 12,000 years ago, this whole area should have been underwater. As we travelled northeast towards the Adra Highlands, it seemed we could not escape the ocean. Miles away from the sea, littered endlessly on the sand were shells, undamaged, perfectly preserved. There are other signs that this desert floor was once the ocean bed, from boats beached miles from the water and entire whale skeletons emerging from the desert sand. Perhaps the sand of the Sahara moved into the water, pushing into the Atlantic, or the land has been rising, maybe the ocean level has been dropping, most likely a combination of factors.
One can imagine that the sea was here not too long ago.
From the desert plain, we travelled to the small city of Attar, which lies at the feet of the Adra Highlands. The grand sweeping mountain range rises from the flat desert, just as Plato described the main island of Atlantis.
The whole island of Atlantis was said to be towering and steep towards the side of the sea.
The seashells, erosion patterns, and geological formations indicate that the sea may have once washed up against the cliffs of the Adra Highlands. In the area of Attar, at the foothills of the Adra Highlands, all the wells produce salt water. That seems extremely odd, since we are 400 kilometers away from the ocean. You would have to dig up to 200 meters deep to find fresh water. From Attar, we made our way up the mountains, which Plato describes as follows.
The mountains of the island of Atlantis were celebrated for their number and size and beauty.
We agree with Plato. The mountain scenery is fantastic. What would await us once we had climbed the mountains?
We knew from Plato's writings that this scenery had to change dramatically if we were on the right track. According to him, we were supposed to reach a huge level plain. After making our way up the mountains onto the ridge, to our amazement, we encountered a vast and nearly endless plain.
The plain was smooth and even.
George and I drove over 4 hours on this never-ending plain, heading for our final destination, which might have been the capital city of Atlantis.
Plato again gives us guidance. According to his measurements, the capital city was enormous. Plato said it had a wall around it with a diameter of approximately 23 kilometers. When you see the Richat in the distance, you begin to appreciate its immense size. According to measurements from satellite imagery, the outer ring of the Richat has a diameter of about 23 kilometers, just as Plato said. This is about half the size of New York City.
There were alternate zones of sea and land, larger and smaller, encircling one another. There were 2 of land and 3 of water, which were turned as with a lathe, each having its circumference equidistant every way from the center.
The Eye of Africa is just that, rings of hills and rings of valleys. And even today, the valleys tend to hold water during the short rainy season.
One is simply dwarfed by the immense size of the terraces. On land, they look like hills that roll into the horizon, but from the air, they form concentric circles. Here we can see that the lower lying areas had been underwater at some point.
Plato describes violent flooding, earthquakes, and tsunamis that destroyed the entire island in a single day of disaster. Most people assume that the city sank away and is now deep under the waves of the Atlantic. However, closer inspection to Plato's account tells a different tale.
Atlantis, when sunk by the earthquake, became an impassable barrier of mud to voyagers sailing from hence to any part of the ocean.
As we all know, earthquakes can cause tsunamis, and tsunamis regress, leaving behind nothing but mud. Here we learn from Plato that Atlantis had turned into a mud barrier, impassable by ships. To date, it has been difficult to make sense of this statement, but if we consider that the empire was hit by an earthquake, washed over by an enormous tsunami, and buried in mud, which became the dry sand of the Richard, then this statement makes a lot of sense. The Atlantic regressed, and the entire city may not have sunk away under the waves, but was destroyed and covered by the mud of the flood. Perhaps it was the Great Flood, known to all cultures in some way.
Could it have been the site of the fabled city?
What could this place have been during the days of Atlantis? And if it was Atlantis, how did the sea regress or the land rise? The 2 main possibilities are tectonic movement and volcanic activity. The entire western seaboard of Africa sits on a shifting tectonic plate, and it's very possible that this shifting is raising the land, as the evidence of the shells in inland Mauritania indicates. If we were to go back 12,000 years and the land was 300 meters lower, the entire area around the Eye of Africa would be an island in the Atlantic, the main island of Atlantis. The water would fill the rings of the Richard, leaving the grand terraces of land, the design of Plato's Atlantis. There is evidence of volcanic activity in West Africa. Only about 500 kilometers off the coast of Mauritania lay the volcanic islands of Cape Verde and the Canary Islands, which give clear evidence of volcanic activity in the area. This could have aided to the rise of land within the last 12,000 years.
We needed to go back to the finer details in Plato's narrative to see if any evidence on the ground could link the Richard to the legend.
The god Poseidon found no difficulty in making special arrangements for the center island, bringing up 2 springs of water from beneath the earth, one of warm water and the other of cold.
We found it interesting that the locals have dug a well in the center island that provides water, and an oasis is formed around it, even though it is in the Sahara, one of the driest places on earth.
And incredibly, unlike the wells in the area that produce salt water, this one produces fresh water.
The country immediately surrounding the city of Atlantis was a level plain, itself surrounded by mountains which descended towards the sea. This part of the island looked towards the south and was sheltered from the north.
The Richat is surrounded by a plain, sheltered by mountains towards the north and open towards the south, just as Plato described. Natalis and I were convinced that we were walking on the same landscape as detailed by Plato.
The surrounding mountains of the city flowed with rivers.
The desert we see before us today once looked very different. Science has confirmed that the Sahara was once lush and fruitful, an area rich with vegetation and flowing with rivers and streams. We can still see the scars of the riverbeds on satellite imagery, which flow down the mountainside towards the Richat, but most of them have dried up completely.
There were a great number of elephants on the island.
In and around the Eye of Africa, we discovered a variety of animal remains. In particular, we were shown elephant teeth near the Richat. These finds are proof of a time when the land was grazed by large animals, like giraffes and elephants, as the rock paintings near the Richat confirm.
Could this have been Atlantis?
What happened to this magnificent city? What happened to the people? Could there be any remnants of this civilization? There is an abundance of ancient artifacts around the Richat area, which makes a compelling argument for cultures that have come and gone in the region. Near the Richat, we were taken to a rough makeshift museum, which has a collection of numerous well-preserved artifacts, saved and meticulously sorted by the locals. Their written and oral history only goes back about 1,000 years, although it is clear that these relics are far older than their formal history. Some of those remnants are ancient stone spheres, which could have served an artillery function. They have a flattened side, so they can be stored without rolling about. You can assume that they were not used by some lone hunter, but kept in shells in large numbers and used in organized warfare. It would have been a most effective method of defense. This type of artillery may have also been used in naval warfare. A lot of those stone spheres have been found in and around the Richat. This gives us further evidence for an ancient, sophisticated society in the area with a proper military setup in place.
One of the artifacts we were shown is a needle made of stone. The needle is made completely symmetrical and is very smooth. It demonstrates a high standard of workmanship and civilization.
A lot of those arrowheads are found near the Richat. They are usually claimed to be around 10,000 years old. The arrowheads are made from stone and are worked with great precision. Plato clearly describes Atlantis as a culture that was handling metals, and copper artifacts are also found around the Richat. Traditionally, archaeologists tend to date them to later periods, sometimes only a few hundred years old. But as a fact, copper was known to some of the oldest civilizations on record, and has an official history of at least 10,000 years. It is estimated that about 200,000 visitors have passed through the area over the past 40 years, with most of them taking archaeological artifacts as souvenirs. However, the region is still abundant with objects of past civilizations. Hopefully, in time, this could be acknowledged as one of the world's richest archaeological sites. In exploring the Eye of Africa, we were shown ancient fishing equipment as well as stone rings that were used thousands of years ago. They resembled the same shape and design we'd seen the fishermen at the coast use to bind and weigh down their nets. It was explained to us how these and other artifacts were once used for fishing. This was further evidence to us that what is now 400 kilometers inland may have once been a place by the sea. So there was no shortage of artifacts in the area. But what puzzled Natlis and I was the absence of any remains of buildings which would have made up this huge city. Of what materials had the buildings been constructed? To find answers, we searched again in Plato's words.
Stone was used in their work.
This means the buildings were made from natural stone, quarried locally. That is very similar to how the locals still construct their homes today, in the ancient techniques that their ancestors used thousands of years ago.
The locals take loose and uncut rocks and use a crude mixture of mud and dung as mortar to build. No bricks are used, just stone from the area.
The stone which they used was quarried from the center island.
Examining a satellite image of the Richard today, one sees what appears to be a quarry or mine in the center. Although the locals are not aware of any mining activity around the Richard.
The stone which they quarried was white, another black, and a third red.
In the valleys of the Richard, the predominant colors of the rocks are a deep red, black, and white. We came across a building which the locals had constructed about 30 years ago, which had been built using the same ancient techniques as their ancestors. Interestingly, this building shows the very same colors as Plato had described.
What had happened to all these structures?
Due to the way the buildings are constructed, only a short while after they collapse or are abandoned, they could disintegrate into a pile of loose rocks with no shape or form. One is unable to see any sign of a building just a few decades after its destruction. This is just how the Richard appears today, endless heaps of loose rocks. Moreover, if the city was destroyed as violently and quickly as Plato described, one doubts there would be much of anything left of the walls and buildings 12,000 years later.
To George and I, it was amazing how closely Plato's description matched the actual features at the Eye of Africa. Each culture has some form of mythology. Myth stems from legend, and legend from history. Often threads of truth are spun into the storytelling that make up myths and legends.
For example, for centuries, Homer's Iliad, which tells the epic adventures in the war against Troy, was considered Greek poetry with no real historical value. It was seen as nothing but a fantastic tale, filled with giants, monsters, and impossibly beautiful women. Even the great city of Troy seemed to exist only in Homer's imagination. However, in the 1870s, a wealthy businessman named Heinrich Schliemann excavated a site he believed to be the city of Troy. Schliemann unearthed several levels of cities, built one after the other. One of them has now been identified as Homer's Troy. An excellent example of how history became legend and legend became myth. Will the Richard one day be linked to the great legend? Another example is the ancient Cambodian city of Angkor. The lost city of Angkor was a legend for centuries. Cambodian villagers living at the edge of the thick jungle told tales of huge temples and buildings hidden in a dense tropical forest. Their stories were casually dismissed by the authorities as legends and fairy tales. However, some explorers believed in the tales of a powerful and rich Cambodian empire, and towards the end of the 19th century, the great temples of Angkor in the deep jungle were discovered. The legend became fact, and the lost city was opened up to the world. A stream of explorers, historians, and archaeologists are still coming to Angkor to study the vast ancient city.
This is another example of how history became legend, and legend became myth.
Perhaps the most compelling evidence that this could have been where Atlantis existed is the size and shape of the Richard. Plato's dimensions of Atlantis were quite detailed. Particularly, the diameter of the outer wall as per Plato and the size of the Richard correspond very closely, with a diameter of 23 kilometers. Let us look at some facts Plato gave us.
The main city of Atlantis consists of concentric circles of water and land.
Fact. That is what the Richard consists of.
The main city was constructed with red, black, and white rocks.
Fact. These are the type of stones which exist in the Richard.
The surrounding lands of Atlantis were grazed by elephants.
Fact. We found remains of elephant.
A well near the central Acropolis provided the city with fresh water.
Fact. Yes, a well was discovered.
Atlantis is based in a part of the Atlantic which is now no longer accessible by ship.
Fact. The Richard meets this criteria.
The capital city of Atlantis was densely crowded.
Fact. The number of ancient artifacts found is staggering, indicating a once dense population.
The area surrounding the capital city is sheltered by mountains from the north and open towards the south.
Fact. This is the exact layout of the Richard.
The main island of Atlantis is marked by a huge plain.
Fact. We traveled for hours through this extensive plain.
The plain was surrounded by mountains leading towards the sea.
Fact. We have seen the mountains leading towards the old ocean bed.
There was an abundance of metals like copper and gold.
Fact. The main export items of Mauritania today are metals like copper, iron, and even gold. The Eye of Africa is the structure that most closely matches Plato's account of Atlantis. Every other site that has been proposed falls desperately short of the dimensions, design, and scale of the fabled city. But what about other evidence?
Is there any way we can link the cultures of people presently living in West Africa to the culture of Atlantis? What do we know about the culture of the Atlanteans?
Well, thanks to Plato, quite a bit. We know from him that their main god was Poseidon, the god of the sea, the god of the waters, usually portrayed as half human and half fish.
What deities does the local population of today's West Africa worship? Over the past 1,000 years, the majority of the local population has converted to Islam. In contrast, the Dogon people in particular still maintain some of their ancient tribal beliefs.
Let us take a closer look. The Dogon believe in spirits called Nomo, usually described as amphibious beings, fish-like creatures. Folk art depictions of the Nomos show creatures with humanoid torsos and fish-like tails. The Nomos are also referred to as the masters of the water. This seems very close to the images we have of the god Poseidon, the god of the sea, which according to Plato was the main god of the Atlanteans.
What else does Plato tell us about the religious beliefs of the Atlanteans?
The god Poseidon fell in love with a mortal woman and begat and brought up 5 pairs of male twin children.
5 pairs of twins. That's 10 children. This is why Atlantis was set up into 10 kingdoms.
Even the names of some of the twins are still very alive in the region. Atlas was the name of the firstborn of the first set of twins. His name is still present in the words Atlantic Ocean, the Atlas Mountains, and Atlantis. The kingdom bordering southern Spain was named after his twin brother, Jadeiros. The old name for southern Spain, Jades, as well as the city of Cadiz, are a reminder of this twin. And the Dogon tell us that Nomo, the master of the water, underwent a transformation and multiplied into 4 pairs of twins.
Both cultures seem quite preoccupied with twins.
The twin cult is still very strong in West Africa. As a matter of fact, one particular population group in West Africa has the highest birth rate of twins in the world. The twin cult finds its expressions in works of art. Sought-after sculptures from West Africa show twins. But even in Western culture, the star sign Gemini depicting twins is very popular, and also fish-like beings are accounted for with the star sign of Pisces, which again is shown in the form of a twin fish. Clearly, the Dogon's belief in amphibious beings ties up with the Atlantean god, Poseidon, who is also portrayed as an amphibious being, as does the preoccupation with twins in both cultures.
The Dogon people have traditional astronomical knowledge about the star Sirius. That would normally be considered impossible without the use of telescopes. Could that knowledge have come from an ancient, highly developed society?
It is believed that for eons, the Dogon have known that Sirius is a binary star system where 2 suns are orbiting around each other, Sirius A and Sirius B. Obviously, with the naked eye, this is impossible to notice. The Dogon further knew that it takes 50 years for one orbit to complete. You would need fine astronomical equipment to pick this up, which the Dogon certainly did not have. Furthermore, the Dogon knew that the one star, Sirius B, is actually a white dwarf star. This is a dying, collapsing sun. Our sun will, by the way, share the same destiny. Via a red giant, the sun is reduced to less than 0.01% of its original size, while keeping the same mass, thus becoming incredibly heavy. For example, a teaspoon of soil from Sirius B will weigh as much as 6 tons. It has 3,000 times the density of a diamond. This the Dogon also knew. They described the dwarf star as the smallest thing, but also the heaviest. The Dogon description of this actually brings the matter to the point much better than our lengthy explanations. There is more. The Dogon knew that there are other objects in the Sirius star system, much smaller than Sirius A and B. There is, until now, no conclusive scientific proof of its existence. Our technical equipment is, as of yet, not advanced enough to confirm or deny this. Critics mention a cultural contamination theory, putting forward the possibility that the Dogon received this information via occasional contacts from Europe in the last century, or even through the researchers themselves by incorrect questioning. Until today, the debate carries on. However, there are other African cultures who have the same ancient knowledge about the star Sirius that was held long before the arrival of the white man and his telescopes in Africa.
Would it not appear plausible that this ancient knowledge that the Dogon and other West African cultures have may stem from a previously highly developed civilization?
The evil eye, or evil look, is believed by many cultures to be able to cause bad luck, disease, or even death. It is comparable to an ill-wishing look, the look of an envious person who is not happy to see you prosper, but will be pleased to see you fail.
To counter this evil look, a protective good luck charm in the shape of an eye is used.
Classical Greece probably had knowledge of the evil eye from the Phoenicians and ancient Egypt. And ancient Egypt again had far older sources which could have come from Atlantis. It is interesting to note that the good luck charm looks very similar to the shape of the city of Atlantis when seen from space. The belief in the evil eye is the strongest in West Africa and in the Mediterranean region, exactly the area which we had mapped out earlier. But the belief has spread to other regions as well, like America, Europe, the Middle East, India, and Tibet. If an eye with blue rings, very closely resembling the water rings of the fabled city, is used as a good luck talisman to ward off evil, then could Atlantis have had the same symbolism for our whole planet, keeping evil away from our world? Let us recall, Atlantis would have been clearly recognizable from space as a structure closely resembling an eye. Because of space travel, the Richards is today known as the Eye of Africa. Plato described a violent and overwhelming cataclysm which resulted in the disappearance of Atlantis. Some speculate that it was the Great Flood or the Epic of Gilgamesh. Whatever it was, it must have been spectacularly devastating to have annihilated a kingdom entirely. All structures were destroyed and buried. Let us consider the following scenario. What would happen to today's civilization if it were hit by a major disaster and reduced to only a few survivors? What effect would this have on the surviving people and human history? In an instant, all electrical equipment would be rendered useless. There would be no more electricity supply, which would mean no more lights, no TV, no computers. All infrastructure would be gone. No more fresh food supplies from supermarkets, restaurants, or shops. Telephones, mobile or otherwise, would not function anymore. Access to fresh water would be lost. Within a few hours, the survivors would be forced to fight for their bare life, trying to find food and shelter. Within only a few generations, most buildings would have crumbled and turned into ruins. Even concrete structures would have disintegrated. After a few hundred years, all knowledge our civilization had will be lost. Science, mathematics, chemistry, physics, biology, geography, all those subjects would no longer be relevant or required by the survivors and be lost within a few generations. Books would have fallen apart, deteriorated and crumbled, with no one able to read them or copy them for preservation. Information stored on computers would be utterly obsolete. Stories of an advanced human society who was able to travel into space would slowly grow fainter. After a few thousand years, nothing would be left of our today's buildings, having been turned into forests. Motor cars would have long rusted away. As time passes, the memories of our technologically advanced civilization would fade more rapidly and only be preserved in some stories and legends. which would increasingly be considered as the imagination of people who are unhappy with their present way of life and who would wish for some fairy tale to be true. Stories of our civilization would have turned into legends. Anyone believing in it would be ridiculed. After a few hundred years, or maybe a few thousand years, new historical events would form the official history of those surviving humans, and this would be declared the real history, the proven history of this age. Maybe some giant power station would still remain in a desolate condition, hardly recognizable from its original shape or purpose, and our descendants might use it as a ceremonial or funeral place, or consider it as a remainder of a great temple where gods, which are long gone, were worshipped. Perhaps some massive foundations would survive as a remarkable structure whose origin would be puzzling. Our history, the history of our civilization, would have become legend, a myth. After several thousand years, the human population would start to grow again, come up with glimpses of progress, start small cities with basic written languages, laws and trade. This would be the beginning of a new era, a new age. Could there have been civilizations before us? Could Atlantis have been a reality? We have established how unkindly time deals with our human accomplishments, like structures and buildings. We can be sure that after 12,000 years, hardly any remnants of a civilization would be found. But we do have the tales, the legends, the myth. In Greek mythology, there is a tale about the 5 ages of man. It was written down from oral history by the Greek poet Hesiod about 3,000 years ago. The first one is a golden age, where man lived among the gods and freely mingled with them. Man lived to a very old age, but with youthful appearance, and did not have to work. After their time on earth came to an end, they became the guardians of mortal man. In the second age, the Silver Age, man started to refuse to worship the gods, and they were destroyed by Zeus, the god of thunder and lightning. They became the demons of the underworld. The Third Age was a Bronze Age. It was a cruel and hard age. Man was only interested in wars and to fight each other. They would not touch fruits, but only eat animal meat. They were stubborn and were wiped out by their own violent ways. The Fourth Age again was noble and righteous. It was the age of the heroes or demigods that fought at Troy, but at last they were also destroyed by their own wars. However, when they died, they would be allowed to go to the Elysium or Paradise, also called the Isles of the Blessed, today known as the Canary Islands. According to Hesiod, the last age would be our present age. He called it the Iron Age, and again, this is a rather unpleasant age. He speaks of children dishonoring their parents, and a time where brother fights against brother. Not the honorable and just person will be accepted, but the liar and the criminal will be supported. Law and decency disappears. So here we do have an ancient account of ages and eons that have existed before us. Of course, there are others. The Mayans, for example, have similar beliefs. In combination with our analysis of what would happen if a disaster would strike our globe with only a few survivors left, we could imagine that some structures on our globe may well be the remnants of a previous age. Could the Richat be one of them? Like the numerous artifacts uncovered in the Richat area, it could be that the secrets of Atlantis merely lie beneath the sands of the Sahara, waiting to be discovered. If the Richards is indeed the site of Atlantis, what does it mean to our understanding of ancient civilization? We are used to being taught a linear view of history, that man emerged from his primal state, slowly gained intelligence and tribal behavior, stumbled through the Stone Age, and survived with simple tools for hunting and building. And that the first cities were formed about 5,000 years ago. Is conventional history really our true past?
Man is a being in search of meaning.
The pursuit for the purpose of life is a search for truth. Along the way, great discoveries are made, and the search itself gives meaning to life. Perhaps civilizations before us reached heights of intellect and organization that we cannot even imagine. Perhaps they were not the fools and simpletons that we think they were. All we have to do is to look a little deeper.